Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon. I'm the Dean of Graduate Research at Flinders University, and welcome to this vlog 16, How to Avoid a Toxic Workplace. This session this week is gritty. It is, I hope, a beacon of a vlog. I hope it is a lighthouse of a vlog. I've worked in institutions where colleagues of mine have killed themselves after relentless bullying and relentless attacks. And for those of us who are left after the suicide in a workplace, we often ask ourselves, what more could we have done? As part of an answer to that question, this vlog today is created for the next generation of scholars, so you can avoid this type of behaviour, this type of action, and we can ensure that this abuse ends now. All workplaces can be toxic, but there's something that's happening in universities at the moment, a debilitating set of behaviours and effects that's having a profound consequence on our colleagues, on our students, on our staff. And let me provide one case study, one example to open up this discussion. In September 2014, Stefan Grimm, Professor of Toxicology in the Faculty of Medicine at Imperial College in London, killed himself. In October, that is 1 month later, an automated email was sent from his Gmail account to his friends, to his colleagues, to his family, explaining what had happened to him. This email had confirmed that he had been dismissed and that there was no place left for his PhD students. The key line in that email was, what these guys don't know is that they destroy lives. They certainly destroyed mine. End of quote. Now, this man was a professor, a distinguished professor in one of the best universities in the world, with a network of really outstanding colleagues around him. If this could happen to Professor Grimm, then what is happening to A-level and junior lecturers on teaching-only contracts around the world? This vlog, therefore, is going to offer to you concrete advice about how to recognise one of these toxic workplaces before you end up working in one. So I'm going to provide a series of diagnostics that through the interview process you pick up that something may be going wrong. Also, as you can pick up, this is personally quite important to me. I've worked through a series of these incredibly toxic workplaces, and from my life and what I want for all of you is to make sure that you never have to go through these experiences, ever. So Steve is going to join me for the last time this week at the end of this vlog to talk through these scenarios, talk through these examples and models to watch for, to be careful of this toxic workplace. So let's quickly and quietly put in some definitions here. The phrase toxic leader was used by Marsha Whitker in the mid-1990s, so it's quite a recent phenomena really, and the characteristics of the toxic leader were quite clear. Selfish, deceitful, and their success was built on the work and the effort of others. Their behaviours were incredibly debilitating for others. So they were selfish, they were narcissistic, they were discriminatory, competitive, micromanagers, they were bullying. They were also deeply inflexible, deeply insecure, and condescending. They gained pleasure from bringing down the life, the experience, the happiness, the joy of others. So when we often ask this question, why would these people behave so badly? The answer is that their bad behaviour gives them pleasure. They use any power they have for personal gain. They assemble a group of people around them, a group of what I often call puppets around them, and what the puppets do is they provide a Lord of the Flies swarm towards people that don't fit into the particular behaviour or ideology of that department or workplace. You find a disciplining culture of the men and women who may compete with that toxic leader, and they use arbitrary power to build up on their status. So very small things become very important, like the size of an office, the view from that office, the importance of a particular parking space. And these are often the men and women that write those really, really long emails, nasty, aggressive emails that they then proceed to CC to half of South Australia. That's also a characteristic of these men and women. The impact of toxic leadership on these organisations, these workplaces, is really profound. You'll see a high turnover of staff, high absenteeism, high sick leave, alongside a series of self-medicating behaviours. So you often see, for example, high levels of alcoholism or drug abuse. You see a loss of motivation from staff, and the workplace starts to be run on fear rather than trust. So these toxic managers can really destroy a workplace. So now the key for me is to try and help you diagnose these organisations from the outside. The problem we have when trying to help you to avoid these organisations is the staff who are trapped within them are often overworked, overscheduled, and deeply frightened. So they're not going to necessarily tell you that the workplace in which they are placed is toxic. So we have to find other ways, proxies if you will, to understand what is going on. So let's work through now some of those scenarios and some of those proxies. What I want you to do is to be able to pick up these toxic workplaces from the outside and avoid them. So let's now go downstairs and have a chat with Steve for the last time. Hi again everyone, and hello Steve.
Hello Tara.
Now this is a very upsetting, a very disturbing topic, and for these sort of topics that's why I always tend to involve you in it as well, so if I get too morose you can sort of pull me out of it a little bit. But Steve, why do you think the contemporary university workplace is particularly susceptible to toxic leadership and toxic behaviours?
I think you're right, the contemporary workplace in higher education is susceptible to toxic workplace syndrome. I think that's because workplace syndrome is very often toxic, actually, in the contemporary world. I would say that you have to look at the history of higher education industry over the last 50, 60 years, really. I mean, when I started in universities as an academic, I started to apply for academic jobs because I didn't want to work for Ford. And Hugh Bainan's great sociology of the workplace, which was actually called Working for Ford, well worth reading, one of my favourite sociology books, which was actually a study of the Halewood plant, which was a Ford plant in Liverpool in the early 1970s. And I think that the point about that book is that it was a study of the contemporary workplace then, and you couldn't have compared universities to it at the time. What's interesting now is that if you had a study of a car plant, there aren't many of them left in Adelaide in South Australia where we live now, you would find that there are connections between the contemporary workplace generally and the contemporary university. And it's interesting, I had a colleague in criminology in the UK who used to talk about going to work as going to the factory. He did it slightly ironically, but as he got older I think he meant it more and more, and I do think that's partly what's happening. We're talking about people selling their labour power, as Karl Marx said 160 years ago. In a way, it doesn't matter where they're working. It's the university is part of a much more general place where you sell your labour power. So I don't think we should be surprised that this general issue, which as you say is extremely upsetting when you're on the wrong end of it, is a much more general issue in the global university.
And isn't that odd that at the very point that Fordism is declining as a practice, as a protocol, and we're supposedly living in a post-Fordist age, that actually there is a Fordism that's aligning all areas of work.
Yes.
Isn't that ironic and weird?
Yes, I think it is. But I think that's what's happening.
Yeah, and I wonder if we should now go into, to continue Mark's, a bit of a discussion about labour surplus. And I think, Steve, one of the great reasons that people end up in a toxic workplace is because of the scarcity of good jobs. So we need to make a living, we need to pay our bills, so we simply accept a job. So one strategy I always recommend, not only that we apply, but recommend it to our PhD students and also to our friends, is when you decide, right, I'm going to move jobs, I'm going to get a job, I say to people, apply for 10, 15, 20 jobs if you can, at the same time. And the reason you're doing that is because you've got a fighting chance of actually getting 3 or 4 of them. And once you get 3 or 4 of them, you actually have a choice. So Steve, how important is that desperation for work as a feeder for the toxic workplace, and how important is choice in mitigating the toxic workplace?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I wouldn't necessarily have thought about this in university applications in the past, but I think you're absolutely right about choice now. And to continue the philosophy of Karl Marx, his argument about the double freedom
Indeed.
Which we have in universities as we have elsewhere today. Basically the idea that you only have your labour power to sell, that's all you have for most of us, our ability to work, in other words, but we can sell it to anybody. The second freedom is that we can sell it to anybody, and therefore the idea of choice is crucial to that. You have to create a situation where you are able to choose, and I think postgraduate students, whether they're going into the university workplace or the contemporary workplace, they've got to have more and more choice. They've got to create the conditions for more and more choice, and I absolutely agree with you. They should be looking at more than 1 or 2 jobs if they possibly can, and realistically hope to get them, and then they can choose.
Exactly. I think desperation is the key problem, isn't it?
Yeah. I think so.
When people are desperate, all of us make errors. So try and avoid the desperation if you can.
Yeah.
So let's talk about the interview if we can. I love talking about interviews. There's such a sort of interesting sociological microclimate. The things that happen in interviews never happen outside of them. And one of the great ways I think you can use an interview is you get to pick up something about the organisational culture in which you may work. And one of the great stories I always tell is about doing presentations during an interview. So you do the interview itself, but then you write a piece and then you deliver it to your future colleagues and future students and so forth. Now, what I recommend is always say yes to those presentations and always do a great one, but I recommend something a little bit different. Watch the audience. So, because the audience are the people you will be working with. So to give you 3 examples of what's happened in audiences after I've delivered a presentation in an interview. Should we do them, Steve? The first one, when I applied for an A-level lectureship in Australia, I got all these jobs, by the way, an A-level lectureship. I delivered my presentation as a young 25-year-old woman, and then the moment I finished, the entire audience started to stand up and have fights with each other, pointing and so forth. None of it had anything to do with me at all, but they were just after any excuse for a fight. So I learned very clearly that was a divided department. Another example, the most toxic workplace you and I have ever worked at, in the interview, in the presentation bit of it, no academics turned up at all. Only a few, 3 or 4 administrators turned up to the presentation. And of course I later found out the staff was so frightened of the dean that they literally would not be with her unless they were forced to be in a room with her. So again, that was a clear lesson. And my favourite example, and this was for a dean post in Canada that I was applying for, did the presentation, all going well, but before the applause stopped, this fantastic woman came straight over to me from the front row and said, "Tara, you must not work here. This is a truly dreadful place. This is the Hotel California. Get out while you can. Wow. So Steve, that's the audience response for the presentation. How can you evaluate your future colleagues from these types of systems and structures?
Yeah, I think that I'm seeing the presentation, if there is one, as a means not just to sell yourself, but actually to find out what the situation is in the particular department or faculty or whatever, if it's a university workplace. I think that's a really good idea. And I think one of the problems is that a lot of the time now, presentations aren't common anymore. And I mean, certainly, one of the things about globalisation and higher education is that the whole development of practices around interviews is uneven. So it may be that you are able to give a presentation, you may be able to travel overseas and give a presentation, but very often presentations are less common now. I think one of the things is that if you're not able to do a presentation for whatever reason, it's possible to make sure that the bits that sell yourself in that presentation can be transported to the interview itself. I think that's a really good tip. Yeah. But the real issue then becomes, how do you find out what the department is like? And presentation is one of the ways to do it, because you receive feedback from your potential colleagues. If you don't have a presentation, you're limited to the people on the interview panel. It's a real problem. And
in terms of Goffman-esque performance itself, in the interview, that's a very choreographed, those of us who have delivered interviews, the questions are all written, the tone, the supplemental questions, so that's highly choreographed. And you're arguing, in fact, the interview is now featuring fewer of these non-choreographed moments.
I think so. Difficult to sell yourself, but you've still got to do it.
Yeah. We're going to get to, in some ways, the fun bit of our discussion today, but also the truly horrifying train wreck bit of our conversation today, because another sign that you're about to enter a toxic workforce is during the interview process, they get you to do horrible stuff, or weird stuff, or really humiliating stuff. And I'll give one example, I'll give your example, and then we can talk about it. But so, for example, I was doing an interview for a Canadian Post. I've applied for a lot of Canadian Posts, got a few. And it was a 2-day interview process. And at the end of the second day, at 4 p.m, they showed me into an airless room, no windows, nothing at all, and gave me a piece of paper. And the piece of paper said, "Your department has just been hit by a zombie apocalypse. Please explain your strategies to ensure that this department survives that zombie apocalypse." They gave me 1 hour and I had to hand it back like it was an exam at the end of the hour. Right, so zombie apocalypse, that's terrific.
I remember that was a true story.
Well, but actually you had a worse one. Again, a 2-day interview program, again for a very, very senior post. All sorts of crazy things they made you do. My personal favourite was you were in a posh suit and they made you put on like a hard hat and there was mud and they made you walk around a building site. So Steve, can you sort of talk a little bit about why these organisations are using techniques that may be more applicable to, say, Big Brother or I'm a celebrity, get me out of here? What's the role of humiliation in these processes?
Yeah, I do think you can compare some of this to reality TV, and of course reality TV has been developing as these practices have developed in universities. And it is true, it was a head of school post, the one that you're talking about, and I was well dressed in a suit and we were bussed to this muddy field. Me and the other candidates were bussed to the muddy field. We were given hard hats, high vis, and we were walked through mud. And we still had to do other performances in this 2-day interview schedule. And at that point, I'd just about given up. I've never seen anything like it. It was deliberate humiliation in a way of you as an academic. What was interesting is that you were being treated really as if you were almost a CEO for a company, developing the building aspects of the job. And I think that's again an example of where the university and the contemporary workplace have fused. I think that's part of the problem. We've got lost somehow in what the role of the university is. That's not to say they don't have buildings, but this was absolutely ridiculous. And it was extinguishing the academic part of what you were trying to get over. Crazy.
Really powerful. Look, whenever they're thinking of putting high vis on you, maybe that's the point you step away from the vehicle. I think high vis is my line in the sand, I think.
Mine too.
But we'll come back to that particular interview because there's another bit of that story we're going to talk about as well. But we'll go to another proxy for a toxic workplace. And this proxy has taken Steve and I probably 6 years to work out, okay, because we're both employed in a toxic workplace, and we've asked each other over that period, what could we have done differently? What could we have picked up to have avoided this workplace? And finally, we've worked out what that proxy is. So we're going to share it with you, but it's taken us all this time to work it out. So please watch for this. So what happens is, this is what I call the overscheduled interview. So you are picked up from the airport by a staff member and driven to a hotel that is a long way away from the place in which you will work. A staff member then picks you up on the day of the interview, delivers you to the interview. A staff member walks you around the campus. You're then picked up in a car and delivered back to the airport. So this is the overscheduled workplace. In this case of our toxic workplace that we both applied for, I asked to stay for one more day at my personal expense, just so I could have a look at the real estate, have a look at the city, see if this was some place that we could work, and I was refused. And the staff made absolutely certain that they dropped me at the airport and made sure that I got onto that flight. So, Steve, what does it mean when universities treat an interview program as if it is a tour of a North Korean nuclear facility?
It's certainly something you should watch for. But again, that's something that, this lack of transparency, lack of openness, in university and non-university jobs, is something that the contemporary workplace is pushing. And I think that's a real problem, because what we recommend certainly to our postgraduate students who are applying for both university and non-university jobs is to make sure they find out as much as possible. Create conditions where there is transparency and openness and so on for yourself, but also you want to find out as much as you can about the North Korean facility. I do think the problem is increasingly that time is of the essence, so that everybody's rushing around. They're trying to create shorter interviews, less presentations, partly because the time in the contemporary university is a problem. So you're having to hurry things. And I think that's part of the problem. I don't think it's always conspiratorial, but I do think this is an issue that potential employees have got to deal with. They have to find out somehow more and more about what they're going into. For those, as Shubham said in working for Ford, for those who want to get into what they're getting into. And I think you really have to do that as a potential employee. And what we're suggesting is that that's becoming more and more difficult. So you have to develop strategies for doing that. Yes.
And one other variable that you may come across that allows that transparency, what is often accidental transparency, to emerge, is when prospective interviewees are invited to a dinner. About 1 in 3, 1 in 4 posts have some sort of dinner where often all the candidates are invited, and that's a whole nightmare in and of itself, or one candidate is invited with a large number of staff. This happened to me once where it was just me and all the staff, and the staff got absolutely and completely hammered. Absolutely hammered. Now the problem was, one of these hammered staff members was responsible for driving me back to the hotel. So when I gently suggested, look, how about I pay for a cab, I make sure you get home, and then I'll just get back to my hotel, this very drunk female staff member said, you can't do that. If you do that, I'll make sure you don't get this job, because if we do that, you'll present the taxi bill and my dean will know that I got drunk. So unbelievably and stupidly, I got in the car with this woman. I'm alive. I don't know how. It's the only time in my life I've ever gotten in the car with a drunk person. It happened during a job interview. Come on. Now, I got that job. and I took it, and I shouldn't have. So, Steve, let's talk about the dinners, the social aspect, which seems to be giving what you want, that transparency, that openness. But how do you handle the dinners?
Well, I think that, again, is a problem because it's presenting the situation as transparent, as open. But very often, it also exposes the fact that, you know, out of the 6 people who are being interviewed for this job, one of them knows the panel really, really well.
And performs it at the dinner.
Absolutely. And so, I think universities have to be careful. I think they very often are trying to be transparent and open and so on, but actually what they do is expose some of the biases in the procedure. I mean, I can think of certainly one case where I was sort of press-ganged into this. I didn't particularly feel that I should have to do it. That's to go out for a dinner with all of the other candidates, and this was a 2-day thing. And in fact, one of the very senior candidates actually pulled out of the 2-day thing the next morning, having been so horrified by what he'd actually seen at the dinner the night before. So even though universities may be trying to create conditions of openness, transparency, sort of community for the interview, they very often are actually alienating the candidates. So I think they have to look very carefully at their practices, but also, again, potential candidates have to be very careful about what they're getting into.
Yes, well said. Rudeness in interviews is also often a big sign of problems, and that rudeness can manifest in lots of different ways. You've had an appalling situation where staff have been passing little notes between each other like they're at primary school, and giggling through that process. Both you and I in interviews had a dean obsessively checking his phone and taking calls during the interview. One of my most bizarre examples involved me travelling for 22 hours for an interview from Manchester for a 50-minute interview. I was not permitted to ask any questions in that interview, and then I was put back in a plane and sent back for 22 hours, a 22-hour flight back. So I couldn't ask any questions. I didn't know really what the job was about, but I did get a sense, you know what? They're not terribly interested in my views. And you know what? I took that job, and you know what? They weren't terribly interested in my views. So how does rudeness operate? Why does it exist? Is it there to try and grind you down a little bit and make you vulnerable, or are people just simply inexperienced and behaving badly?
I think it's inexperienced and behaving badly. I think one of the things that's happened to higher education, we started this blog talking about whether universities are like Ford, I suppose. But actually, one of the things that's happened in higher education, and particularly globally, is that you've had less and less regulation. And with that, it's meant that more and more people who are inexperienced and perhaps, you know, off the leash are doing these sorts of things. They're doing things in interviews or not doing presentations or whatever it is. I think the regulation at one time in universities, nationally and internationally, actually created conditions where these things didn't happen so much. And it's a very, very important point. And as we've had more and more of a global free market in higher education, what we've got is light touch regulation or no regulation or deregulation. I think those are the conditions which create the kinds of behaviours that you're talking about.
Yeah, and I'm doing a big shout out for Flinders, because my next question is also going to be about Flinders. I did an interview, I was the chair of an interview panel, I think about a month into my job, and Flinders enforced that I had to do a training for how to do an interview. Now I've done hundreds of those, but I went, it was a whole morning, and I had a ball, and I really not only learnt regulations, but really worked out how important ethics and kindness and coming into the process is. So again, the regulation really matters there, the governance matters there.
Yeah, there's good practice in universities, but it's a very good example. There is good practice in universities, and we have to take that on board, I think.
And I will continue with the Flinders best practice, actually, because a strategy I would recommend that my current, and can I say wonderful, thank you God, my wonderful current boss, Rob Saint, instigated was after the interview, and after it looked like I was the #1 candidate for this particular job that I'm in, he invited me for a sort of 2-day informal series of discussions.
That's a great idea.
And it was brilliant. It was honest. I came to the situation, he knew I had 3 or 4 job offers, in place. I was certain he had a fantastic field, so neither of us were sort of desperate at all. We just came together for those 2 days to talk and to see if we would get on. And it was honest and it was caring, and you know, I would follow that man anywhere. I am loyal like day is long. But Steve, I wonder what our candidates can learn from that sort of process. I think what we've done wrong in the past is we haven't done enough checking and verification post getting the job offer, I think. So, you know, doing a Skype interview with the future boss or colleagues, talking directly with HR to see if there are any final queries. How important post getting the job are these checking and verification protocols, do you think?
I think they are very important, and again, because in the past people have perhaps been so desperate for the job they've just taken it if it was offered to them. What we said before in this vlog is that we were recommending people create the conditions for as much choice as possible, and if you've got that, you can then go to the various potential workplaces and find out much more and compare and contrast them. I think that's really the key conditions, if you can possibly do that. If you've only got one, certainly follow that up, and there's no reason at all why you can't actually go and visit a second time, as you did at Flinders. I think that's a great idea.
Yeah, and it works very well, I think, because it's demonstrating care and respect. Again, it's all very transparent. Everybody knows where we're at.
Absolutely.
And it's allowing you to be sure. And when we were deciding to move our lives once more to Adelaide, we enacted that movement with much more certainty than we had in the past because of that decent and kind 2-day conversation, I think. Very important. So we've talked about digitisation and using digital strategies to try and find out a bit about these workplaces, but we should also talk about using that great HR consultant, and that is Ms. Google. What I'd recommend very strongly is putting your future business name into Google with the word bullying and see if there are any results. Similarly, putting your future business name in Google with the phrase unfair dismissal and see if anything pops up. But also, Steve, if you're working in a university, go to the Times Higher Education, do a search for the university, search through blogs, and you'll find good and bad stuff. You'll find great scholars who work there and are happy to work there. You may also find other challenges. But Steve, how do you manage the digital proliferation of information about a prospective workplace? What do you do with that information?
It is difficult, and I do think you're right that you should try to, potential candidates should try and find as much out as they possibly can, and digital is one way. But, we all know the difficulties where things are presented which are there, again, digitally to hide. So I think you do have to be as thorough as you possibly can, talk to people that work there, but also back that up by the digital. And there's no reason why you can't do both.
And triangulate. I think, Steve, your point there about asking people, a lot of us have mates all over the world in universities, and I won't name the university, but I got an outstanding head of department job in one of the best universities in the world, the top 1% in the world. 3 of my mates work there, and they said, Tara, do not take this job. This place is out of control. We're trying to get out. Don't you come in. And on the basis of these 3 mates that I've known for 20 years, I didn't take that job.
But as much digital information as you possibly can, social, right the way through from social media to the
Twitter.
University websites.
Yeah, Twitter, so use the PR, but mitigate the PR against other information you might find.
Yeah.
We're now going to get into one of the favourite stories that you tell me about one of your former departments. It was a crazy department, a wild, wonderful department where legal action was endlessly flying around the staff group. One of my favourite stories is one of your former colleagues, I think, undertook 2 separate legal actions against 2 separate heads of school, and he won both times. But you often comment to me that this sort of feral, crazy legal proceedings everywhere department wasn't actually a toxic workplace because it was a very large department. Now, I've never really understood that. Can you tell me about size and why size matters to a discussion about toxic workplaces?
Again, it is a true story. It was a law school, one of the biggest law schools in the UK, in fact. And that did happen, that an individuals sued 2 separate heads of school over several years, and won both times, civil cases. But essentially it was a very large law school, and although it did affect people, certainly affected the people who were sued successfully by this individual, and I think, you know, there was turmoil. Because it was so large, it didn't necessarily feel like a toxic workplace, so that even though I was asked by lawyers, certainly in the first case, would I give an affidavit, that's a witness statement, legal witness statement. You know, I came around to my house, I was very happy to do that in support of the head of department who was being sued. I actually felt most of the time that I was pretty detached from what was happening, and even though it seemed really catastrophic, and in some ways it is horrific really that 2 heads of school were successfully sued, and really people didn't necessarily publicise it very much. You were able to just go to work every day, and there was a faction around this particular individual, but the rest of the people just went on as normal. So I think it partly depends on what the structure of the department or the faculty is. And with more and more deregulation, you're going to get more and more of these sorts of problems. So somehow the structure of the department has to resist this kind of thing. Otherwise, the whole thing becomes toxic. It is poisonous. But actually, that's different to a very small department or very small faculty where everything, everybody's into everybody's business, and that can be even worse, even though they're not suing each other.
Yeah, and that's actually our final question, and the final bit of advice we'd like to offer our guys and gals out there, and that is the separation of the working life and the private life. In bullying and toxic environments in particular, there's this blurring of the professional and the personal life. Toxic leaders feed off the gossip to get information about individuals that they then target for abuse. And you and I have both worked in departments where academics have had incredibly debilitating, a whole series of debilitating sexual relationships that have destroyed one or both parties, or indeed sexual relationship between staff and students. Again, incredibly debilitating. So, Steve, and of course, can I just say, in our lives, we have very, very separate professional and personal lives. So we put all our dignity and care and kindness into our workplace, have a respectful environment, but when we close our door on our house, we really close the door on our house. So, Steve, how important is that public and that private separation to not fuel, to not feed up the toxic story?
I think it's very important, but really much more difficult than it's ever been before to create that division between public and private. You're right that we've, I think, successfully done that. But as globalisation, and actually particularly digitisation, has developed apace, you've got the confusion of the public and private. This is in general, but I think particularly for universities where social media, for example, is becoming more and more of a problem for separating private and public. I mean, where does your workplace stop? So many of us use social media for our teaching or for our research, for our supervision and so on. The question how does the public and private get distinguished is more and more difficult. And therefore, our practice, which has been there for 15 years and we've deliberately done it, is probably rarer and rarer. Yeah. How do you turn off your Facebook, for example? Yeah,
and also I pick up the irony, guys, of what's going on here. We're recording this vlog on Sunday morning in our house. So again, the limitations of the public and private, we're performing as well. So Steve, I want to thank you so much for these last 3 vlogs that we've done together. You are a champion, I adore you, but we've looked at relationships, we've looked at cities, and we finished off with the toxic workplace. So I think it's a very powerful group of 3, particularly for our students in the last year, I think, who are thinking what their future may hold. So particularly for Erin and for the lovely Anna, I hope these sessions have been useful for you. But what I want for all of you students out there is I want you to go to work and feel fantastic. I never, ever, ever want you to go to work and as you go up the stairs to your office, you feel the twist and the turn in your stomach. I never, ever want you to feel that. So I hope you have a fantastic week, but I also hope you have a fantastic career. Thank you, Steve, for everything.
Thank you.
And as always, I wish you love, light and peace. Tea out. See you, Stephen.